everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Finding Hope After Loss podcast. We took a break last week since it was Thanksgiving here in the US. Hopefully, you had a great Thanksgiving and got to eat some good food and spend some time with your loved ones. I wanted to go ahead and mention a new thing that I started recently. I'm currently making customized beaded keychains that represent each person's individual loss and or infertility journey. So basically, there's a specific bead color that represents different parts of your journey. For instance, there's silver for a late loss like a stillbirth, blue for a baby boy, pink for a baby girl, there's gold for a neonatal infant loss, and even a rainbow bead for a rainbow baby. So if you're interested in ordering one, you can check it out on the Etsy shop, which is Journey for Jasmine. So today I am talking with Alejandra. She talks about her losses, including 3 miscarriages and the loss of her son a few weeks after he was born early due to a placental abruption. She also discusses the pregnancy and precautions that were taken with her rainbow baby.
Hello, everyone. Today I am here with Alejandra. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I live in Colorado and I'm a writer and journalist here. I am a mom. I have 2 kids and yeah,
I'm sure that keeps you pretty busy.
it does, yes.
So can you tell a little bit about your loss story or your loss journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2020, I was pregnant for the first time and finishing up my second year of grad school. I was actually right about to graduate with my master's, and this was right before COVID hit, and I started basically I had a pretty normal pregnancy up until that point. And I went in for my scan, my 20-week scan. And at that point, the baby looked great, but they did see that there was kind of a dark mass on the ultrasound and that they couldn't identify. And they told me if I had any kind of bleeding, basically go right to the hospital. And they were going to put me on pelvic rest and bed rest and just sort of keep an eye on it. But they didn't really know what was happening. And actually, as soon as I got home from that ultrasound, I started bleeding. And I was 21 weeks along at that point. So I went straight back to the hospital, and the baby was fine. I was fine, but the bleeding never stopped. It kind of continued for about 2 weeks. And then I was, finally, my OB was concerned enough that she had me admitted to the hospital. And I was then transferred when the bleeding got worse to a hospital that had a really good NICU, about 40 minutes from where we were. And at that time, they were able to determine I was having a placental abruption. Although to this day, we still have no idea why. I didn't have any risk factors. I didn't have any kind of injury, which is, if you don't have risk factors, that's usually sort of their next step is, they asked me if I'd had any abdominal trauma, and I certainly hadn't. So it was a complete mystery as to why this was happening, but it was kind of a chronic abruption, as opposed to sometimes you have an abruption and it all happens really suddenly. And mine was much slower. And after I was admitted to the hospital, they were able to give me some magnesium because I was having contractions. And I was just shy of 23 weeks at this point. So they were able to give me some drugs to slow things down, and give me some steroids for the baby, and then sort of ask us, what did we want to do if our son was born as prematurely as it was looking like he was going to come. because obviously there are not very good outcomes for babies born at or, shortly before 23 weeks. So we kind of went through all of our options with the NICU team. We went through our options with my doctors, and we decided we did want them to attempt life-saving measures if our son was born. And for a minute, it was looking really promising. My contractions stopped, the bleeding kind of leveled out, things sort of seemed to settle down a little bit. The doctor was really encouraged and was saying it was possible, they would keep me for a little bit and I might even be able to go home and stay on bed rest. And then the next morning after that, I went into labor and things happened really suddenly. Got really emergent, I would say. My son was coming, and he was coming sort of fist first, right into the umbilical cord. So it kind of became a situation where they couldn't let labor naturally progress since there was no way to stop it at that point. We had to do an emergency C-section, and they had to put me under for that. So I was unconscious. But he was born, and it was pretty miraculous. He apparently, they told me he was able to cry and breathe on his own for, a second before he was quickly intubated and taken to the NICU. So my son Ronan was born on April 23rd, 2020. So kind of right at the beginning of COVID. And my husband was able to go right to the NICU with him, which was great. And when I woke up, they actually wheeled me right down there while I was still in my hospital bed, and I got to see him. And he was just over a pound when he was born. He was truly incredible. He made some really huge strides for being a 23-weeker. He was the tiniest baby in the NICU, and the most gestationally premature. So he had many admirers, lots of people coming to check in on him and get updates on him all the time. That he was able to come down on his ventilator support, and he was gaining weight like a champ, and just making some really, really encouraging progress. A lot of preemies, especially that young, have multiple brain bleeds, and we were incredibly lucky in that he didn't initially, and then he did develop a very small brain bleed, but nothing that they were super concerned about. So the main concern was just that he was so tiny and so gestationally premature. It was sort of a battle daily just to get him through the day sometimes. He was doing great for his first month, and then when he hit 5 weeks, he came down with an infection really suddenly. And it was like I had been with him the day before. He was totally fine. He was doing great. He had even come off his ventilator, which was incredible. So he had some oxygen support with the CPAP machine. But I was able to hold him almost normally, which when you have an intubated baby, it takes like a whole team of people for you to be able to hold them. It's like the baby is sort of put on you by at least 2 respiratory therapists and at least 1 nurse, and they tape all the tubes to you. And but with the CPAP, it's much less complicated. You don't need to call over 4 people if you want to hold your baby. And I was able to hold him and normally almost. And then the next morning they called me and told me that he had gotten sick very suddenly early in the morning. And they were very concerned about him. And at that point, things started to go downhill pretty quickly. Um, he was just very, very sick, and his body was too little to fight what was going on. So he kept going up and down really, like really, really severely. There were a couple times where, it was clear that the doctors were trying, it was like a life or death situation. They were trying to save his life. And he would always kind of keep bouncing back. And that sort of continued for a week. And then on his 6-week birthday, it just became clear that he couldn't fight what was going on, and we were going to have to say goodbye to him. So my husband and I were able to be with him when he died, and we had such a wonderful team of nurses with us as well, and doctors. So we had some incredible emotional support throughout that, and just kind of walking us through what was going to happen. And it was really wonderful to be able to be with him. As horrible as it was like it would have been so much worse if we couldn't be there. And since we were just over an hour away, it was lucky that we were able to get there in time and be with him. And then, after that, of course, after his loss, it was incredibly difficult and complicated because of COVID. So that, like anyone who lost a loved one during COVID, we were isolated. We were, of course, it was hard to, we were very lucky in that we were able to have a small service for him. And that was so important to us because none of our family were able to ever meet him. His grandparents weren't able to meet him. His aunts weren't able to meet him. And so just to be able to have some small celebration of life it was really helpful for grieving and for some closure for us, as well as for the rest of our family. And his older sister, she also was never able to meet him, and it was very confusing. Of course, she was 4 at the time, and there was sort of no way for us to bring her into the NICU at any point. Parents had just been allowed to go back into the NICU, which I'm endlessly grateful for. I can't even imagine what folks who weren't able to be with their babies did. The director of the NICU said that he fought really, really hard to get parents into the NICU, just because it helps babies' outcomes so much. But yeah, it was really challenging, just with COVID, as well as it's a horrible loss no matter when it happens, right? Like, it's terrible to lose your child. And I think we were just incredibly lucky in that we have a wonderful support system, near and far. So even though there was still a lot of isolation, we had people checking in with us, and our best friends had set up a GoFundMe right when Ronan was born, and had sort of like put together a little video of people sending us love and support. And we certainly felt very held by our community, which I'm so grateful for, and I know that not everybody has. And as like this first year of loss kind of progressed, I actually got pregnant again in let's see, I guess it was November or December of that same year of 2020, and it was a surprise. It was not intentional, and I miscarried that pregnancy at 7 weeks, and then at that point, my husband and I, even though we hadn't been trying and weren't sure at the time, we weren't sure if we were ready. We decided that first loss sort of made us realize we were ready to try again, even though it was still early on. So we started kind of trying at that point, and I got pregnant again in February of 2021, and again miscarried that pregnancy at 7 weeks, and then got pregnant again in a few months later. And this pregnancy did have a heartbeat. I started having some bleeding again and found out that I had a subchorionic hemorrhage, which it's actually pretty common, but my subchorionic hemorrhage was very large, which can be dangerous to a pregnancy. And despite the fact that, I was being monitored pretty closely because of my history of loss and miscarriage, I'd had all this testing done, they kept a very close eye on me just to provide as much support as they could as the pregnancy progressed. And unfortunately, I started around 11 weeks. I started bleeding more and more. And then at 13 weeks, pretty much to the day, I miscarried that pregnancy, which was a little boy, who we had named Kieran. We had just found out that it was a boy. And at 12 weeks, we had felt safe enough because things were looking good, despite the fact that I had that hemorrhage. Many people have these hemorrhages and go on to have healthy pregnancies that go to full term. So we had felt, fairly confident that the pregnancy would continue, and had shared the news with our daughter. So it was, another devastating blow. And we lost that pregnancy a few days before the anniversary of the 1 year anniversary of Ronan's death. So it sort of felt like a double whammy. And we felt really hopeless at that point, and just kind of like, I don't know, just sort of wondering, first of all, why this was happening, because to this day, I don't have an answer for that. We have no idea why any of this happened. And I think that can be the hardest thing sometimes, is just not having any answers, knowing that there must be some underlying issue, right? And even, a doctor that we spoke to told us, like, no, it's not just terrible luck. You're not cursed. Like, there clearly is something going on, but whether we can find out what that is a different story. And all the tests that they could think of just come back as normal. And so that was, even though, of course, I didn't want to be told, like, oh, you have a rare bleeding disorder, for example, it would have been better almost than just not understanding what was happening and why our babies kept dying. Especially because, the testing, which a lot of which is very invasive and very expensive, they'd go in and say, oh, it looks like you should have no trouble carrying a healthy pregnancy. And so then to just keep having this experience over and over, it felt just absolutely devastating. So after we lost Kieran, we kind of spoke to our doctor and decided we would talk to a fertility clinic. We clearly had no trouble getting pregnant, but obviously sustaining the pregnancy and having a healthy pregnancy was our main concern. So we met with a fertility specialist, and they did even more testing and were kind of able to confirm like everything looked as it should with my body to carry a pregnancy. And then they told us we could start trying after a few months had passed. We could start trying again, and then they would provide us as much early intervention and support as is possible. So we started trying again, and actually early October 1 year ago, I found out that I was pregnant. And they pretty much, I think it was like starting around 5 weeks of pregnancy, I was taking 2 kinds of progesterone. I did progesterone and oil injections. They put me on a steroid regimen. I was taking a bunch of antihistamines. I mean, just everything the doctor could possibly think of to try to kind of like keep my immune system as calm as possible and provide as much progesterone support as possible. And it worked. It was the first and only healthy pregnancy I've ever had. And it was a textbook normal pregnancy, which is still shocking to say. It was, there was never any bleeding. There was never any danger to the baby or to me. I was monitored super closely throughout the entire thing by a high-risk team. They were seeing me weekly for a little while, and so I got tons of ultrasounds and got to see a lot of my baby while I was pregnant. And then at the end of May, pretty much almost a year to the day of our last miscarriage, our son Zane was born, and he's happy and healthy. I actually had a scheduled C-section at 36 weeks just because of my history and because of the type of C-section I had with Ronan. They didn't want me to go into labor. It could have been dangerous for me and for my son Zane. So they scheduled our C-section for 36 weeks. And, despite being a little on the early side, he had a brief NICU stay and a little extra support at the hospital, but he is happy, healthy, thriving. He's 5 months old today, actually. And he's doing fantastic, which is, it's so complicated because I am so happy, and our family truly feels complete. We feel as like we can't believe that this really is happening to us. That sort of like you have to pinch yourself sometimes, but it also, I think I'm not alone. I know there are so many lost parents who a healthy baby, a rainbow baby, almost highlights what you miss with the children that you've lost. And especially with Ronan, just the things that we didn't get to do with him and the experiences we never had. I think sometimes I feel that really acutely when Zane hits another milestone, and it just kind of reminds me of how old Ronan should be now and what he might be doing now. And then at the same time too, it's like we weren't intending necessarily to have more than 2 children. Our daughter is adopted, so we were, we have her, and then we were having a biological child, and that has sort of been our family's plan. So it's strange too to think that Zane might not be here if Ronan were still here, and to hold that as well is complicated. So it's an interesting place to be and a beautiful place to be, but also the grief never really goes away. Obviously, having a healthy living child doesn't take away from the pain of your children dying, and I think that can be complicated for people to understand too sometimes. Even though lost parents, we know that all too well. We feel that pain constantly, even when things are going well, even when you have your rainbow baby, you're still sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and thinking of the child you have who's not here, or children who aren't here. And yeah, it's just not an experience I ever expected to go through, but here we are, and I'm just incredibly grateful to to not be on the other side of it, because I don't really think it ever ends, right? But I guess to have survived, if that makes sense. Like there were so many times I didn't think I would survive, and yeah, just being here today feels like a win, you know?
I know exactly what you mean. It's so complicated, all of it. You're, like you said, you're so grateful for, the baby you have now, but it just brings up so much of what you're missing out on with your other kids. And it's all just so like complicated. I guess
Totally.
that's really the only way to describe it. It's just complicated.
It is. It's just complicated. It really
So,
is.
why do you think that it's important to share your story and to talk about your loss?
I think, when Ronan died, I didn't personally know anybody else whose baby had died. I had friends who had had miscarriages, and they were incredibly helpful. But I really felt lonely, and I felt like, I don't know, I just felt too like I couldn't really talk about it. And then I found that the more I did talk about it, the better I felt. And I also found other people who had experienced something similar to what we had gone through. And that was so helpful. It helped me so much. And so I think if I can share my story and help somebody else realize that, logically you may know you're not alone, right? But if I can help somebody else realize that they aren't the only person to have gone through this experience, or that there is somebody else out there who gets it, without you having to to explain, I think that's huge. You can't put a price on that. And I just think talking about this reduces the stigma. Nobody ever made me feel like I couldn't talk about Ronan, and I'm so lucky for that, because I know a lot of people experience really insensitive comments, or people just get really uncomfortable. And I'm lucky that my immediate support system has never made me feel like I can't say Ronan's name. They bring him up to me. We celebrate him on his birthday. There's never any stigma personally, but in the outside world, I just think it's rare to feel like people just don't know how to handle it when you say my baby died. And so I think the more people who do want to share their story, and because unfortunately, it's not as uncommon as people think sometimes. I've now met so many people who've gone through something similar to us, or at all stages of gestational development, and all different kinds of loss. And the sort of common thing we've all had is that we never really thought it could happen to us, and then it did, and it feels isolating. And yeah, I just think the more that we talk about it, the less stigma there is and the less alone we feel.
Is there any aspects of loss that you think need more attention or you think need to be talked about more, like just specific aspects?
I think talking about like late term loss and just sort of, you know, I've now experienced loss at different at different levels, right? Different kinds of loss: early miscarriage, a little bit later miscarriage, and then neonatal loss. And I do feel like it's still less common to talk about later term losses. I really think that needs a little bit more attention. I think it's because it's so scary. People, once you hit a certain point in pregnancy, nobody wants to think, oh, this thing could happen, that thing could happen. I'd never even heard of a placental abruption until it happened to me. And I think, you know, just having some awareness around different complications that can happen later in a pregnancy is really important. And then I also think is support for parents who do experience those losses, those later losses. I really think that should be discussed more, because I do really feel like people just don't want to think about it, don't want to talk about it, and then when it happens, you feel like you got hit by a train, and you know, you don't understand how this could have possibly happened. So it's not like I want people to be scared their entire pregnancy, like, oh, maybe this could happen or that could happen, because you can start to fall down that rabbit hole. But I just having awareness is so important.
I totally agree with you on that. You know, we're always taught like, oh, you make it past that 12-week mark and you're okay. And,
right.
You know, as we all know, that's not really the case.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, and like you said, I agree. Like, I don't want to scare people, but I think people need to be aware that this happens more often than you think.
Totally. And I wish that it didn't. And I also think there could be plenty more research and into why these things do happen. Like it is wild to me that it's 2022 and placental abruptions are not common, but that can happen and does happen frequently enough that they say, well, you know, sometimes you just get unlucky. And it's like, clearly I'm not just unlucky. Clearly there is something that caused that, but no, you know, there's not a ton of research into why, or, you know, how to prevent it. When I was asking in my pregnancy with my son Zane, like, what can I do so that this doesn't happen? You know, are there signs I can watch for? When can we tell if I might be at risk for this? They were kind of like, well, you know, if you start bleeding again, like they didn't really have much to tell me in the way of like, how can we keep this baby safe from an abruption, other than just, we're gonna watch you like a hawk and hope we catch it in time.
Which
So
isn't
yeah,
always comforting.
yeah, right.
Like,
exactly.
can you give me more concrete information, please?
Right. And it's like, you know, I know that they're not magicians. I know they can't predict the future, but oh man, I just wish there was more understanding of complications like that, and others as well.
So is there anything else that you'd like to add or share?
No, I don't think so. I guess I would just say, like, if you're, you know, to anyone who's listening to this who does feel alone, I'm so sorry that you're going through this, and you aren't alone. And you know, I will say, like, the more that I have talked to other lost parents, the better I've felt. Like, it doesn't take the grief away, but it has just helped me feel so much more seen. And I just really recommend it. If you've been feeling isolated, reach out to a support group or to somebody on Instagram or to someone in your life who you know has experienced loss, because you don't have to go through it in silence or by yourself.
I think that's really important because so many of us try to just, oh, I can handle it alone. But we don't have to. So why do it, right?
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about your boys and your story. And it was really nice talking with you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was nice talking with you too.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, for sharing your story with us. I've had so many people tell me that neonatal loss is just another type of loss that doesn't really get discussed much. Sometimes they don't feel like they fit in the pregnancy loss category since their baby was actually born and lived, but also sometimes they don't feel like they fit in with the infant loss category either. Neonatal loss is its own unique type of loss that deserves separate space where these families can talk about it. All of our experiences are worth sharing. You never know who you're helping by sharing your story. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, we are all in this together.